We take chances all the time. In fact, life is the business of taking risks to reap the rewards. The question I'm trying to answer in this talk is which risks associated with radiation are worth taking. Hi, I'm Adu, and this is 4D Worldview. We celebrate risk-taking in many fields of endeavor, from the entrepreneur to the sports field where the hero risks well-being, life, limb to rise to the top. Yet when it comes to the dangers posed by radiation, a large portion of the population appears to be completely averse to taking any risks at all. To decide if this is based on real concerns or irrational fear, we have to look at the facts. There are hazards all around us, from almost inconsequential uneven paving to potentially lethal potholes in the road. We are constantly and unconsciously assessing the risks associated with these hazards and deciding whether we are willing to face these risks while pursuing the rewards. A risk is the combination of a hazard with a chance of falling victim to the hazard. We tend to avoid hazards where the chances of the hazard occurring is very high and or if the hazard is particularly extreme. In other words, when the risk is too high. The properties of a hazard that are taken into account in the risk assessments are severity, how deadly the hazard is. Some hazards will simply cause discomfort for a short period of time, while others will result in gruesome deaths to scores of people. An example of the latter would be a dam wall built upstream from a large city. Immediacy. How long after taking the risk would the hazard cause the loss? Some hazards will have an immediate effect, while for others the damage may only occur years later, as would be the case where a sportsman is taking performance enhancement drugs. Visibility. Some hazards are visible, while others cannot be seen, heard, or smelled. The invisible hazards are usually feared more than those that we can detect with our senses. There are a number of factors that influence the balance between the risks and the rewards. For example, the rewards outweigh the risks when rewards are more than the risk. When the risk and the rewards are measurable and of the same nature, for example, the return on an investment where potential monetary reward is much bigger than the investment, it is a simple comparison. But in the case where the rewards and the risks are different, the assessment becomes a personal choice based on the individual's priorities. An example would be the risk posed by eating too much calories. When the reward is immediate and the risk delayed, poor diet is a good example again. Here, the reward can appear to be bigger than the risk. Only after years of reaping the reward will the cost to your health become apparent. Often, we can see the reward, but the risks are invisible. This factor is often exploited in the advertisement for fast foods. How the hazard is perceived is therefore very important. The nature of the hazard is often not well defined and you can be subjected to diatribe. That is, lengthy rants of criticism with very little scientific risk assessment. Be careful not to be taken in by emotion rather than cold facts. You must always take the risk into perspective. It may sound terrifying to hear that risk is doubled, but if the risk doubles from 1 in a million to 2 in a million, it is still negligible. Opponents to an idea will often exaggerate the risk. The risk-reward balance can often be skewed by the agenda of the presenter. Be aware that factual information can be presented in such a way that the risks are blown out of perspective. Here is an example. Ban hydrogen monoxide, the invisible killer. DHMO is colorless, odorless, tasteless, and kills thousands of people every year. Most die from accidental inhalation. Prolonged exposure to its solid form can cause severe tissue damage. Symptoms of DHMO ingestion include sweating, urination, vomiting, and electrolyte imbalance. Also known as hydric acid, and is a major component of acid rain. Accelerates corrosion in metal, may cause severe burn, erodes the natural landscape. Causes electric failures, is found in all tumors, has been found in all streams, lakes and reservoirs, still used as industrial solvent and coolant in nuclear power plants, as a fire retardant in food additives and in cruel animal research. The military receives tons of it through sophisticated underground networks and stores it for later use. By now you have probably realized that dihydrogen monoxide is H2O, or water, and that every statement is true. Yet we are facing these risks every day without thinking about it, because the rewards far outstrip these risks. To understand the risk of radiation, it is useful to look into the historic background and see how this influenced the risk evaluation and perception. Röntgen discovered X-rays in 1895 and produced the first permanent X-ray image of his wife's hand. The next year, Becquerel discovered radioactivity. Marie Curie played a massive role in understanding radiation and, along with her daughter Irene, paid the ultimate price when they died from radiation-induced diseases, aged 66 and 58 respectively. Radiation boom times. Very soon after the discovery of X-rays, medical uses started and ramped up. It is now the backbone of medical imaging. It also did not take long before radiation was being used for treatment and the Radium Institute in Paris was established. Cancer therapy using radiation is now also mainstream. It also did not take long before non-medical uses started to appear. Some of the more bizarre uses were fitting shoes and quackeries like radioactive drinks, uranium electric blankets, and dirty weekends when the radiologists realized that a well-aimed dose can induce temporary sterility. But then the bubble burst. Radiation workers, as well as the users of radioactive drinks, died from exposure. The use of the atom bomb and the accompanying radiation injuries, as well as nuclear accidents, sealed the fate of radiation as a serious hazard to be respected. The danger was recognized, and it became clear that the protection was needed. To manage the risk, the International Commission of Radiation Protection was established in 1928. The ICRP started with a clean slate, and physicists were involved so that a quantitative assessment of the risk was done. To understand the risks, we have to look at the sources of radiation first. The man-made sources are diagnostic medical uses like X-rays, CT and nuclear medicine. There's also exposure from medical treatment like cobalt units and linear accelerators. Radiation is used in quite a number of industries. Some of the examples are industrial radiology, where iridium sources are used to check the integrity of welds, sterilization of medical equipment, radiation of herbs to increase shelf life, smoke detectors and level indicators in huge silos, to mention but a few. The use and testing of nuclear weapons are probably the most feared and at the same time misunderstood sources of population exposure to radiation. By far the biggest source of radiation to the population, however, comes from natural sources. Cosmic radiation in the form of fast-moving charged particles releases showers of secondary radiation. Fortunately, we are partially protected from this source by the Earth's magnetic field and the atmosphere. Therefore, the higher in altitude we are, the higher the dose. It is maximum during long, high-altitude flights or for astronauts. There are also a number of terrestrial sources of radiation, like potassium-40. But by far the most important source of radiation is radon and its daughter products. This slide summarizes the various sources of radiation doses to the public. Notice that only 1.1% of the dose can be ascribed to sources other than natural and medical, with medical at 12% at the same level as doses we receive from food and drink. Despite the fact that we simply cannot escape from natural sources, we take extraordinary measures to avoid the 1.1%. Clearly, there is a disjoint. Now that we know where radiation comes from, we need to look at what this radiation does to human health. The biological action of ionizing radiation takes place primarily on the genetic level. Through direct and indirect actions, single or double strand breaks of the DNA can take place. At extremely high doses, cell walls can also be compromised. The health effects of radiation strongly depend on the dose. For high doses, please note this only applies to nuclear accidents and nuclear warfare for very short periods of time. The effects are deterministic in nature. That means that below a certain threshold there is no effect, and the severity of the effects increase in direct proportion to the dose received. These effects are acute in nature, and the patient either recovers, sometimes with a permanent disability, or dies soon after the exposure. For low doses, the health effects are usually stochastic. This is where the incident depends on the dose received, but the severity is usually independent of the dose. For example, there is an increased chance for developing thyroid cancer when exposed to iodine-131. These effects can either be somatic, that is affecting the exposed individual, or hereditary. The ICRP attempted to take this quite complicated risk and simplify it to set limits of exposure. The aim was to provide an appropriate standard of protection without unduly limiting the beneficial practices giving rise to the radiation exposure. We will examine later on if they succeeded. The protection intends to protect humans from the harmful effects of radiation to individuals and to their descendants. The assumptions used are that a single mutated cell can lead to malignancies, that there is no repair to DNA damage, the injuries to DNA do not depend on the dose rate, and that is simply an additive random process. We will see later that these assumptions are almost certainly all flawed. These assumptions led to the linear no-threshold theory. That is a very simple way to plot the incidence of malignancies against the dose received. The risks are known reasonably well at high doses from studies conducted on atom bomb survivors. This point on the risk versus dose graph is then simply extrapolated to the 0 point. The limits can then be read from this graph by determining the dose where the risk is the same as in a safe industry. Here is a graphic representation. The magenta line, labeled 3, represents the linear no-threshold graph, while the yellow line, number 2, shows what it would look like if there was a threshold below which there were no detrimental effects. Based on this philosophy, the ICRP Report 26 of 1983 recommended that the average annual whole body dose equivalent must be limited to 50 millisievert per year and 5 millisievert per year for radiation workers and a member of the public respectively. These limits do not include medical and natural background radiation exposure contributions, since they are just to be beneficial and unavoidable respectively. As we will see later, In some places on the Earth, the annual natural background radiation is higher than even the radiation worker limit. This makes one wonder. The current recommendations are even stricter, with a limit of 100 millisieverts over 5 years, which averages to 20 millisieverts per year, and not more than 50 millisieverts in a single year for a radiation worker, while the limit for a member of the public has been reduced to 1 millisievert per year. In defense of the linear node threshold, we can say that nobody has accurate data for the low doses regions, and one should rather err on the conservative side. This solution is simple and practical, and by now well established, and therefore the politically accepted status quo. There are a number of strong arguments against the assumptions used for the linear threshold approach. Firstly, no biological system follows a linear response. Take ordinary table salt as an example. It is lethal at high doses. For an average human, the lethal dose is around 10 teaspoons. At intermediate doses, there are progressively permanent damage to organs that can lead to drastic reduction in life expectancy. However, salt is essential for life at low doses. I love nuts and can eat nuts in all forms and quantities, but allergic individuals can experience anaphylactic shock and even die if their food only contains trace elements of nuts. Humans have been exposed to natural radiation for as long as we have existed. In fact, there is convincing evidence that the natural radiation background was higher for some periods in the past. In order to survive, we have developed defenses against DNA damage. Single-strand breaks are repaired because all the information is still there on the second strand. Some of the DNA damage can be lethal, and when the cell tries to divide, apoptosis takes place. This is a form of programmed cell death when the damage to the cell, not only from radiation, becomes unsustainable. Large sections of DNA are either not switched on in a specialized cell or has no function, so the damage can be inconsequential. We still do not know exactly what causes malignancies. There have been multiple factors from diets and lifestyle to hereditary traits that have been identified as contributing factors. It is therefore clear that there are multiple steps that must fall into place before a malignancy takes hold. To therefore have a one-size-fits-all approach to every form of radiation is clearly erroneous. There is also credible scientific support that there is a threshold in the radiation dose below which there are no health consequences. The first study that supports this is when it was noted that luminous watch dial painters that literally licked the radioactive paintbrushes only exhibited ill health if a threshold was exceeded. There are also places in Iran, China and India where the natural background radiation is much higher than the average. It can be as high as 360 millisieverts per year in Ramsar, Iran. Now remember that the limit for radiation workers is 20 millisieverts per year. Epidemiological studies conducted in Yangying in China, another of the high radiation background areas, found signs of higher rates of chromosomal aberration in the population living in the area for generations, but there were no influences on longevity or increased incidences of any diseases. There is even a group of scientists that believe that low levels of radiation is good for you. The theoretical basis for this claim is that for low doses, like immunization, it stimulates the body's repair and apoptosis mechanism. Hence the term radiation hormesis was born. There are a number of studies that support this theory, and what made these studies more convincing was that the authors originally set out to prove the opposite. A study conducted on dockyard workers working on the US Navy's nuclear fleet found an inverse relationship between the incidence of malignancies and radiation dose received. The same results were found in a study comparing lung cancer incidence to levels of radon in homes in all the counties in the US. When it was discovered that the steel used in some apartment buildings in Taiwan contained radioactive cobalt, a study was commissioned to see how many additional cancer cases this caused. Again, it was found that there were fewer cases in the radioactive buildings. The green line in this graphic representation shows the risk profile in the case where radiation or hormesis exist. I actually met someone who sought a license to put a small radioactive source under his bed. He was so convinced that it would be good for him. He was certainly not a crackpot, but a well-known medical physicist who studied this field his whole life. There are therefore sound reasons why the linear no-threshold theory should not be used to inform us on radiation protection. It is not founded on sound scientific reasoning, and the one-size-fits-all approach is misunderstood and abused by the media and politicians that are making mountains out of molehills. Conforming to these ridiculous limits becomes way too expensive and stops the beneficial uses. It is also not applied consistently. A good example is that the production and use of phosphate fertilizer exposes the general population to 300,000 man-Sieverts per year. Now compare this figure to the fact that the same figure for the Chernobyl accident is a total of 600,000 man-Sieverts. If we apply the linear no-threshold theory consistently, then the phosphate fertilizer industry is causing the same amount of excess cancer cases as the Chernobyl accident every 2 years. Yet is not considered a radiation risk at all, and no limits are imposed on it, and neither should there be limits on it. In this case, even the most ardent anti-nuclear activists would agree that the improvements in the agricultural productivity far outstrips the risks, if there are any radiation risks at all. Malignancies causation is a 16-step process, and radiation dose is simply one of many factors that contribute. It is therefore in nobody's interest to set up a whole radiation protection industry to look into only one aspect. There is no single simple model to explain radiation risks. There may well be something like radiation hormesis at play for certain types of radiation exposure, but by the same token, there may be certain individuals who are sensitive to radiation and potentially already have 15 of the 16 steps in place for developing cancer, and a small dose of radiation might push them over the limit. There are some blood tests and genetic markers that are being investigated to identify persons with radiosensitivity, and in the future it may be possible to identify this section of the population. Since the cells in a growing child divide much more than adults, it's also reasonable to assume that children should be protected more than adults. Radiation risks should not be seen in isolation and should be lumped together with all other risks. Each industry should be allowed to manage the radiation risk in conjunction with all the other risks. I always found it ridiculous that in the medical setting, ophthalmic lasers are highly controlled and very safe, while the use of needles are orders of magnitude more dangerous and poorly controlled. You don't need 3 licenses to own and use a needle. This graph shows all the potential curve shapes of the theoretic risk. Notice the red curve where the risk is higher at low doses than predicted by the linear no-threshold. It should be possible to determine which approach to use under which circumstances to get individualized risk management regimes. Finally, let us examine which risks are justified. In the case of medical applications, we are comparing medical advantages with medical risks, even though there may be a delay in the effect of the risk. Even using the restrictive rules currently in place, it is reasonably easy to make a case for all medical uses of radiation. However, there are still some treatments of benign conditions like plantar warts and tennis elbow that should be used more than is currently the case, due to the erroneous assessment of the risk-reward balance. I find it quite curious that opponents to nuclear power almost always argue that there are huge scientific advancements in the field of renewable energy and batteries, but still insist on comparing their favorite option to decades-old nuclear technology. In this case, I will concentrate on the newest technology with much better safety features and generating much less radioactive waste, like modular, molten, thorium salt breeder reactors. The risk for the release of radioactive material into the atmosphere during normal operation has and will never be a problem due to strict operational safety procedures, monitoring and safety design. In modern designs, the inherent safety will prevent accidental release. In the case of molten salt, even when the temperature increases above operational temperatures, there is no risk of overpressurizing the reactor vessel because the core remains a liquid. If you are interested in the details, please leave a comment below and I will do a talk on the subject. There is an argument that nuclear power stations can be subjected to malicious action to cause a release or even build an atomic bomb. I have thought about this for quite some time, and as a physicist have contemplated how I would go about this if I had terrorist inclinations. It soon became clear to me that it is so complicated that your efforts would be better spent on more primitive terror attacks. It simply does not make sense. Waste management is another hot potato that has become problematic. Not because there are no acceptable scientific solutions, but because politics are preventing the implementation. They are very stable deserts with virtually no groundwater, animals or human interactions that can be utilized for burial of the small problematic fraction. The generated waste is also getting less all the time as the designs improve. The rewards are affordable, reliable base load. The cost of nuclear fuel is typically half the price of the equivalent coal, and the difference in cost comes down to the building cost of the power station, much of which is consumed by the safety features and the fact that the old traditional stations were massive. This fraction of the cost will come down with the new modular designs. In the new designs, the fuel is replenished on a continuous basis and the waste removed. Some of the waste can even be used as medical isotopes. Much of the cost of the energy comes down to the fact that the generation takes place close to the source of the fuel and not where it's used, and must therefore be distributed through a network to the end user, adding additional losses and costs. Because of the high energy density of nuclear fuel, this is not a problem, and with a modern modular design, the generation capacity can be moved closer to the end user. With a concern about the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, nuclear power should be high on the agenda, as the carbon footprint of a nuclear power is even lower than solar. Thorium and uranium can be used as nuclear fuel, and these elements are some of the most abundant elements on Earth. It would therefore take a long time before we run out, by which time nuclear fusion might have been perfected. I am therefore convinced that nuclear power should become an important part of the energy supply mix. The way iridium-192 is used in industrial radiography at present is concerning to me, as I have seen a number of radiation injuries to workers from cutting corners. To what extent this is due to restrictive regulations being ignored or lack of safety training is unclear. However, this is an instance where there is much room for improvement. There are, however, many industrial applications that have long excellent safety records, and some potential applications like nuclear-powered spacecraft, aging of wine, changing the color of semi-precious stones can also be promoted. The military has long-standing experience using nuclear reactors to propel large seafaring vessels, and it makes sense to do the same for commercial vessels. This then brings us to the question if and where the military should use nuclear technology. It is quite possible that the huge threat of a nuclear attack has actually prevented conflict. The nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft carriers are definitely there to stay. Finally, I have to agree with Pierre Curie. I am amongst those who feel, along with Nobel, that humanity will obtain more good than evil from these new discoveries. If you have not viewed any of my other videos and you have enjoyed this, perhaps it's a good time to join my channel and hit the like button. Next time I will answer the question on why the Earth's surface is warmer than that of our Moon, despite the fact that they are the same distance from the Sun. You cannot miss this.